Hamas has been crushed, just as Hezbollah has been crushed and Iran has been neutralized. And all of these things are factors in why we reach this point now.
Welcome to The Debrief, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the headlines they're covering this week and where the story's going next. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by Editor-in-Chief Hugo Gurdon. And Hugo, it's always dangerous to talk about anything in the Middle East because it could very quickly be overtaken by events. But President Trump has announced what looks like a pretty significant diplomatic breakthrough in the Israeli war against Hamas in Gaza. Walk us through a little bit. What seems to be on the cusp of happening?
Well, certainly it is a huge deal. And the one thing that one can say, one hopes unequivocally, is that the hostages that Hamas took on October the 7th in 2023 will be returned. And that should happen, as President Trump said, Monday or Tuesday. In exchange, there will be a much greater number of terrorists, Hamas terrorists, released from Israeli jails. The Hamas obviously calls them political prisoners,
Sure.
And it's referred to as a prisoner swap. But that sort of equivalence that should not disguise the fact that this is this is a big victory for Israel and for President Trump. Hamas is on its knees. Even in the cabinet meeting today, President Trump said that even Iran had supported this deal because essentially Hamas is in no position any longer to resist. Whether or not it moves beyond this to the disarmament of Hamas, which I think one has to assume that Hamas does not negotiate in good faith.
Right.
It doesn't drop its plan to eliminate Israel, but it may not actually see any way forward other than to go ahead with this, essentially a ceasefire deal with the exchange of prisoners. There's much more, of course, that President Trump would like to see this progress to, with an overarching peace in the Middle East, etc. And it is very, very significant that so many of Israel's Muslim neighbor countries are backing this. Obviously, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the list goes on. So it's a very, very big deal. How much further it gets towards the sort of overarching peace is obviously very much up in the air.
Yet at the same time, President Trump took a very different approach than many of our European allies, and certainly the ceasefire now crowd at home, some of whom are fairly muted in their reaction to this deal, which, if everything goes according to plan, would actually deliver a ceasefire.
Yeah, I think one of the extraordinary ironies of this is that very shortly after countries, France, Britain, Australia, Canada, all gave Palestinian statehood recognition in exchange for nothing. What President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu have now delivered is the return of the hostages without giving a promise of Palestinian statehood. So what has happened in the last few days under the leadership of President Trump points up the kind of impotency, fecklessness, etc., of those once fine and great powers, and their irrelevance. It also, I think, points up the irrelevance of the United Nations, which is a body set up to produce this kind of thing, but in fact was an impediment to it and helped run schools in Gaza that fostered hatred of Jews amongst children. And the other thing where you don't see now is, even though for 2 years, as soon as since Israel began its fight back against Hamas, you've had people all over the world who are actually really just supporters of terrorism against the Jews, saying there must be a ceasefire, the genocide must end, etc., etc., etc. Fake genocide. You don't see them celebrating now, because in fact the deal that has come about, the arrangement, is, as it were, a sort of final recognition of Israeli and American victory in this past 2 years.
And in that regard, its approach to achieving this outcome is fundamentally at odds with what they were all saying was essential to really end the conflict.
Yes, exactly. In fact, what ended the conflict was Israel's readiness and indeed determination to fight a war which Hamas began. It's absurd, but also very easy for the terrorists to start a war and then for their supporters to say, oh, there must be a ceasefire now, because they started to lose it. Well, they started to lose it a few days or at least a few weeks after they attacked. But you don't get to start a war and then to say, oh, we have to have a ceasefire when you start to lose it. You pay the consequences. And, Hamas has been crushed, just as Hezbollah has been crushed and Iran has been neutralized. And all of these things are factors in why we reached this point now.
Thank you, Hugo.
Thank you.
You can read Hugo and the rest of our political team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.